Venezia, Venezia, la Serenissima, the most serene republic. That's right, we are headed from Rome north to Venice, Italy. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. Venice was its own republic in the Renaissance. In fact, it was an independent polity for almost 1,000 years. Venice was founded in the 8th century on some kind of marshy small islands in the Adriatic Sea, and it rose to this huge republic that eventually ended up basically colonizing the whole Dalmatian coast. That's right. Modern day Croatia was once part of the Republic of Venice. So we will see Venetian art and architectural style spread all around the Adriatic coast. Venice grew to a powerful republic that lasted well into the late 18th century. Venice was a little bit different from Rome. So remember that in the 1400s, Florence rises to power because of all of their money. As we move into the 1500s, in the 16th century, we see a shift of that power back to Rome. Rome is attempting to take back power that it lost to the Florentines. Meanwhile, in the 16th century, we see a great deal of power and wealth in Venice, in the Republic of Venice. So we're moving away in the early Renaissance from Florence to the High Renaissance in Rome and the Venetian High Renaissance in Venice. What is so unusual about Venice? First of all, it's a port city. Venice is built on more than 100 islands that are all connected by waterways, and now in the modern era by walkways and bridges. And it is a port city where boats were coming in from all around the Mediterranean world, and Venice really had this connection to the east, to the sort of Asian worlds, because of its trade with the area that is now called Turkey. So we had actually a lot of Turks in Renaissance Venice. We also had North Africans, we had Germans and Austrians coming down from the north to do business at the port. And because of its state as a port city, it was for many hundreds of years an extremely ethnically and culturally diverse place. There's lots of influence from people who are living in North Africa, people who are living on the Dalmatian coast, and as I said, other Europeans from the north all coming and converging in Venice. It really creates a kind of eclectic, multicultural place with many different people from many different parts of the world. And so Venice was also known as a place where you could have sort of a taste for the exotic, where you could get spices and art objects from the East. So it was this very cosmopolitan metropolis at the time in the Renaissance. Another thing that is unusual about Venice is that the religious leaders were chosen by the secular leaders. So secular power was very strong in Venice. And it made for a place that was perhaps compared to other parts of Italy at the time more open-minded. A fun fact that I always love to tell people about Venice is that at a certain point during the Renaissance, they actually legalized sex work. And one of the funny things about it is that they did it in an attempt to sort of quell the rampant homosexuality that was going on in Venice. And it's like, that's not really how that works. But leaders at the time thought that if they could make sex work legal, that maybe the Venetians would engage in a little bit more hetero sex. So Venice was also known for its high class courtesans. These are women who rose to power and riches, not only through their sex work, but also through their education, their poetry, and their intellectual contributions to the culture of Venice. So it was a very unusual place at the time in Italy, and perhaps more of a kind of open-minded or progressive place compared to Florence or Rome at the time. So remember, we're shifting gears and locations from the High Renaissance in Rome up to the north in Venice, and we're going to talk about Venetian painting. Now, a couple of things about the Venetian painters. First of all, who will we discuss? In this video, I will talk about Tiziano and Giorgione, but there are other Venetian painters in the Renaissance. Some of the big names are Giovanni Bellini. Well, actually, there's a whole Bellini family of painters. Or Carpaccio. Carpaccio is one of my favorite painters. He does these really interesting, very detailed scenes of Venetian life. But for this video, we'll talk about Titian or Tiziano and Giorgione. Now, what are we going to see when we look at Venetian painting in the 16th century? The Venetian painters were among the first in Italy to use oil paint. And as we know, the artists of the Northern Renaissance used oil paint earlier than the Italians. They used oil paints first, and they really mastered oil paints. And this comes into Venice from the north, and we see the Venetians really mastering oil paint earlier, perhaps, than some other parts of Italy. So what does this have to do with Venice? Well, we remember that with oil paints, we're able to get really bright, vibrant colors. And the Venetian paintings from this period are known for their deep, rich colors. And perhaps this is an effect of what it's like to be in Venice, actually. You walk around this city where there are no roads, but instead waterways and bridges. And this water all around you is sort of reflecting the sunlight and creating beautiful imagery as you walk. Think about if you've ever been to the ocean, or you've been to a lake or a river, some other body of water, and you've seen the sun kind of twinkling on the ripples of the water. And you see the different colors that the water can change based on the sunlight and the atmospheric conditions. And you'll start to understand what it's like to be in Venice and to have this shimmering light around you at any given moment. And you see this drama and this color and this lighting in the Venetian paintings. So the Venetians are really known for their color. Compared to artists in Florence and Rome, the Venetians are also less theoretical in a sense. They're less strict about painting and drawing and tight control. They're a bit more playful with paint itself. They have this love for color that supersedes their interest in drawing. So think back to Leonardo da Vinci and think of all of the almost scientific way that he paints using linear perspective. There's something very analytical about it. And in contrast, the Venetians sometimes were known to not even sort of sketch or draw the image first, but to instead start painting directly onto the canvas. So they cared more about the nature of the paint itself. They were more playful with the paint, whereas the Florentines or the Romans were a little more tightly controlled with their drawing and painting. In Venetian paintings, you will also see that light can be softer and more atmospheric, that this love for light and color is really reflecting the location of being in Venice itself. We will also see with these paintings, and it's a little difficult to see on the screen, so you just gotta go to Venice someday, but we will see that they are more painterly. The Venetian painters exploit the potentials of oil paint. You might even see visible brushstrokes at times. So they place less emphasis on drawing. They might skip an underdrawing altogether and paint directly onto the canvas. And they are using all of the same principles of high Renaissance art that we see in central Italy, but with a bit more of a relaxed approach to painting. So one of the great Venetian painters who you should absolutely know about is Tiziano, or sometimes in English you will see him referred to as Titian. He's really one of the leading and extremely influential artists in Venice, and his legacy really is felt throughout art history. He influences artists well into the 19th century, even in the modern era, and he had some of the most powerful patrons, kings, popes, emperors. And of course, he also painted the images for the Catholic churches of Venice. So let's look at one of his first important early works, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which is in the Church of Santa Maria dei Frari in Venice. So you have to go to Venice to see this altarpiece. It's his first major commission, and sort of soon after this kind of launches him into fame. It's this altarpiece, so it's hanging behind the altar in this otherwise sort of Gothic looking church, but we have a very high Renaissance style. The painting is oil on wood, and it's a really heroic image in terms of scale. The figures are extremely large, and so it can be viewed from anywhere within this church. It creates a lot of drama with these huge figures. So what's the subject matter? The subject matter is the Assumption, the bodily Assumption. Mary's body, after she passes away, is sort of carried up to heaven at the time of her death. So Mary here is depicted in this red robe with this billowing blue veil around her. She's kind of floating on or surfing on this sort of cloud that's held up by this retinue of angels, and up above her with this sort of lid on the composition, we have God the Father depicted with some angels. And in the foreground, we see this sort of space of earth. These are perhaps her friends, the followers of Jesus, the disciples, etc. And they are all sort of reaching up and surprised and, overwhelmed by this sight of Mary being taken up to heaven. So Mary is this central figure. She's kind of larger than life. And the apostles are reaching up to her. So they're gesticulating. They're reaching their arms up and creating a sense of movement and drama that's a little bit different from that calm, restrained high Renaissance that we see in Rome and Florence. Here we have more diagonal lines that are something that we will see coming soon in the 1600s when we talk about Baroque art. So Titian is considered influential in, ushering in a sort of new style in the Renaissance. We see Mary dressed in this red robe and this kind of alternating red and blue and green. We see the red repeated in some of the figures down below. And in fact, there's even a red that's referred to as Rosso Tiziano, or Titian red, that Tiziano becomes known for. This magnificent, brilliant red color that shines and emanates from the painting. You can see that behind Mary is this golden light, perhaps referencing Venice's Byzantine influence. If you go into the Church of San Marco in Venice, you will see it's completely covered in gold. And that strong Byzantine or Eastern influence is coming from Turkey to Venice. And so we'll see this kind of golden sky as a remnant of medieval and Byzantine art that perhaps influences Titian. This golden light is also a symbol of the golden light of heaven that Mary is being assumed up into. And this cloud below her creates that division between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. And then again at the top we have God the Father creating this kind of lid on the scene. And this is something also characteristic of Tiziano. You will see it in his other paintings, this tendency to kind of use a cloud or something to create a lid to his scenes, almost like putting a lid on a pot, creating this sort of lid that closes the scene. But in general, compared to the high Renaissance in Florence and Rome, we can see more drama, more diagonal lines, more movement, and really an interest and focus on color over line and composition that is typical of high Renaissance art in Venice. Now, I mentioned that I would talk about Tiziano and Giorgione. So let's look at a Giorgione painting. This painting is attributed to Giorgione, but may have been finished by Tiziano. So these two, Giorgione and Tiziano, were super close, BFFs, hung out together, painted together, and sometimes would even paint on each other's canvases. So perhaps Titian finished this painting that was initiated by Giorgione. This is Sleeping Venus from about 1510. This was commissioned as a marriage picture, so it was very romantic, gift for the patron's fiance. And it was supposed to be this depiction of Venus. And these gifts were intended to instruct the new bride, the fiancée, of sort of the ideal characteristics, perhaps, in a wife or a lady. What are the ideal characteristics? The ideal characteristics are that a woman should be beautiful and attractive and sexually available to her husband, of course, but she should also remain loyal and somewhat passive. And we really see that depicted in this painting. How? First of all, we have Venus lying in the nude outdoors in the countryside. And you know, there is some talk about this idea that in the countryside was where people could be free versus the city has its laws and its rules. And once you can get out in the countryside, you can express yourself freely. And it was often the place where people would have romantic encounters out in the countryside. So here she is lying out in the countryside on these really beautifully depicted fabrics, completely in the nude. Her naked body is echoed by the curving hills of the Venetian countryside, these rolling hills of the landscape. She is a depiction of the goddess of love, so she's not a specific human woman. She's immortal. And there had been a Cupid depicted that would sort of help identify her as Venus, but this was later removed. But it's still meant to be a depiction of Venus, and she's sort of lying in this pose, this gesture where her hand is covering her private areas. This is referred to as the Venus pudica, the modest Venus, where she's loosely attempting to cover herself and at least feign modesty, but it's somewhat feigned because she's actually on view for all of us to see. This is painted to please the male patron. Here, the female body is objectified and becomes the object of the male gaze, and she is lying eyes closed, looking down, passive, her sort of vulnerable body stretched out for the pleasure of the male viewer. So there's this implied ownership or domination of the female body, which makes sense because in this instance, this is a gift by the patron to his fiance. And really, women in the Renaissance, when they were married off, they were essentially owned by their fathers until they could be married off, and they were basically sold to their husbands, and their husbands had all of this sort of political and economic power over women in the Renaissance. So that objectification and that sense of ownership and domination makes sense when you consider the context. You'll also again notice this gesture of the left hand. Some scholars say that this is an attempt to depict modesty. So this is a gesture of modesty, of covering. And others have suggested that perhaps she is pleasuring herself. There is some evidence of a belief at the time that women needed to orgasm in order to conceive. And so perhaps that might be related to this image as well. And of course, it's perhaps fitting since this is a wedding gift after all. And of course, women would be expected to create an heir for their new husband. The kind of rolling hills of the landscape would add to this erotic connotation because people would often meet for amorous affairs out in the countryside. So the setting and of course the depiction of the nude body was really setting a new standard for a new trope in art history. And it really is with Giorgione and Tiziano that we see this tradition of the reclining female nude that lasts for centuries in art history. I will talk about another painting, Tiziano's Venus of Urbino, in the next video, so check that out.